Hey everybody, welcome to EIS Live. It's really good to be back. Been missing the broadcast. Seems like a long time, but I'm really happy to be back. Those of you who know that my wife and I are going through some things, thank you for your thoughts and for your prayers. Really do appreciate that. So as always, I'd like to go through a little bit about what EIS is about for those of you who don't know. And for those of you who do, you're going to hear a little bit more today about why you should connect and how to navigate through this journey called life in such a way that we really bring lasting transformation and change. But at EIS, what we do is first of all, we're really a counseling, coaching, and mentoring entity that we're really here to help people find freedom in their lives to become all they're intended to be, to find out their purpose and their why, as opposed to a counseling organization or something like that. Counseling implies that something's wrong with me and I have to go fix it and then I'll be okay, kind of a thing. When in fact, we're really all kind of okay. We just don't know ourselves very well. And we have a difficult time navigating in our life situations and relationships. And that we really want to get in touch with that so that we can really change and discover healthy patterns in life as individuals and in our relationships and our businesses and so on and so forth, as opposed to just fixing certain areas and being fine. We also extend this process into leadership development as we believe leadership starts from within in the home and then is translated outwardly from there. So it's not just being a great problem solver or decision maker, but developing a heart to lead and desiring to raise others up in the process to be all that they're called to be, instilling character, integrity, and accountability and other hallmarks of genuine leadership. It's hard to instill those things if you don't have them going on in your life yourself. So that's another aspect of what we do. So we offer a comprehensive approach to personal growth and maturity, from the individual to CEOs and businesses and everybody in between. And throughout the broadcast today, you'll see some banners on the screen intermittently on how to connect with us if you desire to do so. And then lastly, our live shows like today are here to feature testimonies of people's lives that have been transformed in many ways. And of course, they're still on their journey. Other professionals in the field of helping people in similar ways, EIS staff counselors, authors of books that we believe are important resources that help support our work at EIS. And then finally, I guess, before we get started today, I want to remind you that you're welcome to ask questions, and we will post them, hopefully, if we have any time left at the end of the show, and be able to answer some of those questions and give you some recommendations at the end of our time together. So on with the show. So today I would normally be introducing my co-host, Vanessa, and she, of course, is our media czar, taking care of monitoring all these broadcasts, posting on Instagram, Facebook, etc. But today is different because Vanessa is actually our guest, and I'm so excited and happy to bring her on. So here she is.
Hi, Bill.
Hey.
How are you?
Awesome. Awesome.
So excited to be here with you. This is a different dynamic for sure, but I'm excited.
Well, me too. It's going to be great. And Vanessa and I were just chatting a moment before we got on, and it's really great when you're kind of a fly on the. If we could just be flies on the wall with listening to people talk, because when we're just chatting, it's everybody in a private conversation, I think, just has this propensity to be much more loose, and then when we're on something like this, it's like, oh, everything's focused on me.
The nerves definitely come into play.
But like what you were sharing before, and what we talked about in terms of community was just really what it's all about, And one of the things that you said earlier that I, as we kind of move into your story, was that, before you had started in the process, everything was just about you. And not just about you in terms of like some kind of, egocentric person that just wanted all the attention to be on you. For you, and you're going to talk about this, I'm quite sure, about, with parental inversion and taking on the load and carrying the load, was much more of it being about you, is like all the weight is on you. I think that's what you were referring to much more.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing. And that, it feels like literally the weight of the world, your world, is on your shoulders. And that puts you in this position of being, morbidly introspective, meaning like when we look inside of ourselves, we don't see somebody who's capable, because we feel incapable and weighed down all the time and judgmental against ourselves and other people and angry.
Yep.
Um, it's kind of the hallmarks of what happens when you bear the weight of the world, because we were not meant to do that,
Exactly.
But anyway, that's what we started kind of chatting about. But what I'd like to do is, and I know you have the notes in front of you, I'm sure you do, is, talk a little bit, like we always do, is like a little bit of your background, leading up to how you got involved.
Yeah. So I'll definitely start off with just a bit about my childhood. I could probably go on forever and ever, but just kind of the bullet points, and then I guess how I came to meet you. So I guess the first thing, my parents got divorced when I was like 6 or 7 years old. So from the time that happened, I mean, divorce is so common, but it's hard, and I went through a lot in terms of like assuming responsibility. From that point on, I kind of took a parental role, especially for my younger brother. My parents definitely didn't get along well. So I kind of was like the middleman between them in terms of communication and all of that stuff. And then I watched my own parents, after them splitting up, go on their separate ways. And they were involved both in toxic relationships. And, especially with my dad, I was really like his confidant. And there was a lot of conversations and information I was privy to that I probably shouldn't have. And I really just felt like I needed to kind of be everybody's go-to person. So essentially, whatever role I had to play, I was there to do it. I was there to make other people happy. And that's really where I found my worth. So I never really grew up knowing who I truly was, because I could be anybody anyone wanted me to be. And it wasn't coming from like a selfish place of, oh, I just want to be the best and like I want to be fake, but it was more so just like that's how I thought I truly was valued and loved, was just by doing whatever someone wanted from me. And that obviously then created like a lot of violations in terms of myself and boundaries and all of those things. And I think a turning point was when I was like 14 or 15. My mom had gotten remarried, and I that put a strain on our relationship. Her relationship definitely wasn't the healthiest. And I kind of was put in a situation again where I had to like shield my brother from things and all of that type of stuff. So created a lot of resentment between her and I. And it came to a kind of a point where she told me to leave, and I kind of was kicked out of her house.
How old were you then?
14. Yeah, 14 or 15. So she had told me to leave. I was very angry with her. I remember vividly getting into an argument with her in our driveway as she was pushing my stuff out. And I was just like, really what it came down to was that her husband was influencing a lot of things and was speaking into her ear about just me and my behavior. And it wasn't necessarily what my mom felt, but she felt she had to kind of like do what her husband said. And so if he was upset with me, she was instantly upset with me. So I remember saying, it stinks, but like just being like, you're pathetic. Like you're just letting a man like come into our relationship. And I really started to harbor this judgment and resentment towards my mom. And I went months at a time without speaking to her. I really felt like I had been abandoned. And before my mom and her husband had kind of gotten to this point where the relationship was not in a good place, because it wasn't always that way. I mean, she was like my best friend. I was very close with her. It was always like me, her, and my brother. That's just how it was. Like I would see my dad occasionally, but so that was that. And I went through a really rough period of just depression and not. I think like when someone's supposed to love you unconditionally and then they don't, it's kind of like, well, what does that say about me? How valuable am I that someone can just pick up and walk away, especially if it's their child? And obviously there was a lot of components that played into that in terms of like my receptiveness then of her like trying to come in and out of my life and all of that. But at that time, I actually then met Matt, my boyfriend. So from the start, Matt was kind of viewed as like my knight in shining armor, because I was going through all these things at home and I was spiraling and I was depressed. And, he kind of came into play and I was like, oh, all my problems are fixed. This can be like the perfect fairy tale. And I put him on like a pretty high pedestal, and it's just a lot of pressure, I think, to put on somebody. I don't think back then we really knew that all this was happening, but looking back, obviously, um, I can see how this all unfolded. And I was 15 when I met him. Matt was 18. We were definitely like young puppy love, but I think as time went on, it was kind of like, all right, you can't just rely on those initial feelings. There was a lot of dysfunction at play, especially on my end, in terms of just my anger and the way that things came out. I had a lot of feelings, but most of the time I didn't let them come out because, like I was saying before, I wanted to be on point at all times. So I never wanted to appear weak. I didn't want to let anyone in on what I was truly feeling until it usually came to boiling points. And because Matt by nature was just the closest person to me, he usually dealt with those explosions. So whether that was me like jumping out of his car and storming off or whatever it was, definitely wasn't healthy. But Matt had obviously met you first, Bill, and had gone around you and started working, engaging in the process. And I didn't really know much of what was going on, and from a business sense, a EI solution sense, I didn't really know much. And it was funny, like I remember Matt coming to me one day and started talking to me about God. And I was like, who is this person? Like, I don't even know my boyfriend. Like, is this a cult that he's a part of? Like, these were the thoughts that were going through my head of like, this is someone that I spoke to and like had very strong opinions at one point, and now he's like completely changed. And I was seeing these things kind of from an outside perspective. So I got very defensive and was like, what's going on here? I need to meet this person and whoever and whatever. So Matt had said like how important obviously you were to him. And I was kind of like, well, I wanted to know for just selfish reasons. And then at the same time, I think obviously I was meant to be brought to you. So I had kind of had somewhat of an open mind. But yeah.
Before you go on, maybe you were planning on going down this road a little bit, but the relationship and the state of the relationship, during this period of time, talk about your MO a little bit, like how you were functioning in the relationship, how you were kind of coping, hoping, and kind of acting out.
Yeah, I think there was two parts of me. I think when I wrote a daily a few weeks ago, I touched on this, how like there was two Vanessas. And one was in the face of conflict, I would either like recede and not say anything, completely disassociate, and I just wouldn't go there. And then the other part of me was this explosive. Anything could trigger me. Like you said something the wrong way, and I was like off the rails within a few seconds. So I think was completely out of control. I was completely out of tune with who I was, what was triggering me, my emotions. It was kind of like I was just this this firework that could be let off at any time. And obviously the way Matt handles things, it was hard for him to even try to engage in conversation with me because there was just no logical, like anything to anything I was doing. It was, you never knew which Vanessa you were going to get. There was like the sweet kind, the person I think I always have wanted to be and like deep down am. And then the person that's on top of that was being triggered left and right.
So a lot of trauma triggering at that point.
100%. And I obviously didn't know what any of that meant. So I just felt completely out of control. And there was a lot of internal conflict because it was like, Vanessa, why are you acting like that? But then so I would do something and then feel like crap, about doing it. And then going back and doing it all over again. So it was this toxic cycle of just.
So yeah, there's no way out at that point, right? So like you probably knew it or began to know it. I mean, don't forget, we're talking about teenage years here. Even under the best of circumstances, for a teenager to grow up and be in a relationship, particularly, and do it healthily, is pretty rare. And then having a dysfunctional background, causing these triggers, like you said, they're trauma triggers. All of this is going on at the same time, and you're just trying to survive at that point, I would imagine.
Yeah, definitely.
Hmm.
And I think like deep down, I always like knew like, oh, I want to be with this person. But then on the surface, like, and Matt and I say this all the time, like it was kind of like, how at that point we were like, how are we ever going to be together? Like this is a mess. There's just no way. It's so dysfunctional. So like the heart was always there to like want to do good, but I just had no idea how. And I just felt completely out of control because I just didn't have knowledge of anything that was going on inside of me, and
Mm.
everything was just gonna affect me, and it usually was in a negative way. So that's where I was at when I was, thank God, brought to you.
Okay. So you were kind of moving ahead, still thinking, I believe, that, well, ultimately getting married and that kind of dreamy la la land projection into the future was just going to fix it, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things that I came to realize through your help was just, and a lot of it I think has to do with the timing in which we met, and it was this thought that like I needed Matt because Matt had always kind of been there for me and was like the safety net.
Mm.
So I just thought that like, oh, there was no me without Matt. So I thought that I needed him, and it came from this place of hurt and I think not knowing my worth, not knowing who I was, and I just wrapped my identity all up in this person.
Mhm.
So when I had first come to you, I did so solely for my relationship. I was like, oh, my Matt wants me to do this. I have to do it. I'm gonna try to fix my relationship. It wasn't from a point of like, oh, granted, I didn't really have any idea what was going on, but it wasn't like I was looking to help myself first, which I then very quickly realized was what needed to be done. I couldn't do this on the basis of, oh, I'm doing it for my boyfriend. And because I'm gonna just do whatever my boyfriend says. And not that that was the case, but that's just kind of how I viewed it. Was like, oh, gotta another person to please, you know?
Mhm. So that meant moving ahead, examining, your own life, um, your own brokenness, your own traumatic history, and all of those things. So we started. Well, first of all, you learned your temperament,
Hmm.
and that, of course, opens the door for us to have a greater degree of understanding and self awareness of what the heck's going on inside of us and why we do things the way that we do. And then tied in with helping to take your thoughts captive, of course, and understand, like, oh, wait a minute, this is what I'm doing. This is, you know, this is not healthy. I can choose something different. Like all those things start to become possible once you start being self aware and you can see how you're actually acting instead of just acting out all the time.
Yeah.
Right. And then next, after that, we start doing the journaling exercises and all that to start digging into, your history. And then, of course, moving towards forgiveness and getting rid of those judgments that we had against yourself, against, parents or whoever else was in your life that needed to be forgiven and so on. So, what was that part of the journey looking like too? Because that's the part that we generally, all of this is doing the work, of course, but that's the hard work. I think it's some of the hardest work is getting in touch with those deep areas of brokenness.
Yeah, definitely. And I know from myself, I definitely was not in tune with that. And I think that was just how I survived. Was I most of the time I didn't go there unless like a certain thing happened where everything kind of came flooding out of me and then it all would be stuffed back in. So most of my life was spent kind of just,
Mm.
I knew there was stuff wrong and I knew I had certain feelings, but it was really hard for me to like ever pinpoint it or to think back to these things because it just would like erupt a lot of feelings that I just didn't want to tap into. So in the beginning, it was very confusing because I think I had this wall up for so long, and if anyone would have asked me, I would have been like, "Oh, I'm just confident, like I'm good, like I got it all together." And you started to kind of crack away at that, like piece by piece. So then it's hard because it was like, all right, well, I'm broken. Am I this person? Like, who am I? And it really evolved into that question of really who I was, and I didn't know. And I think the first step of that was obviously getting in touch with all of the brokenness because that really shaped who I was up until that point, and I kind of needed to get in touch with that so I wouldn't allow it to just kind of control the rest of my life, because it was controlling me, and I was just letting it kind of like run rampant inside of me and not really knowing what was going on. So it definitely was in the beginning confusing. I didn't really know much of what was happening, just kind of like, oh, this stuff hurts. I'd get off calls with you and be like, I need to take like a 3-hour nap. So I kind of again felt a little bit out of control in those beginning sessions, but then as I think I kind of started to understand more and more, and I was able to implement in little pieces, just the things that you were talking to me about. It was like, hey, I can start to take power back. And that was really, it was a lot different than I'd ever been used to.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then I think a major point that I, I think back to is like the first call that you, me, and Matt ever had together. And you had kind of just explained to me that like, there's a lot of things that you need to work on yourself, and being in a relationship makes that a lot harder, because you're now having not only your personal issues that you're dealing with, but then those issues are being magnified like times 10 in your relationship, and they're showing up in an even more intense way. And you had just spoken to us a bit about like, hey, if you're going to stay together, like this, you have yourself, you have to be a priority. And I remember I was like, if we stay together, like, is he kidding? And I like slammed my laptop and like so upset. I'm like, how could he ever say that to me? Like, but it makes so much sense, like, because I went into it with this mentality of like, oh, it's about me and this other person, but it all came back to me, because my relationship was never going to be good if I didn't fix myself first, because all of
Hmm.
those things were just going to continue to show up whether I liked it or not.
Yeah, and especially in relationships, things like the codependency, the the lack of boundaries, the people pleasing aspects, all of that stuff, that really was rooted in your past.
Hmm.
Not to mention, caretaking, and caregiving, and having to be the strong one, all those things that make up your baggage, and talking about, and I want to kind of lean into and have you explain this too from your perspective, this idea of parental inversion, and your trauma child, and learning what that looked like to distinguish between the two, because it can be kind of weird sounding to people who don't understand that concept. But I think for you and most of the people that I have shared that with, it really helped them to understand, um, that when they start observing what they're doing in response to other people, particularly in these areas of codependency and people pleasing and so on, they start to see like, is this coming? Where is this coming from? Is it coming from that trauma child, or is it coming from the genuine me who I need to be?
Hmm.
And instead of trying to be in control, like you said earlier, like thinking I have to control my world, I can exercise self control. And there's a big, huge difference between that, because self
Hmm.
control is more like discerning, like, wait a minute, I can respond differently to this.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So, can you kind of talk about that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think the biggest example that's been present in my life, and it's funny because when I first started talking to you about like trauma and all of that, I really only spoke about my mom, just because that was like the most recent stuff that was happening, and it was very just like on the surface. Whereas the relationship with my dad was something that I really had to kind of dig through. And I remember you saying to me like, "Oh, like your relationship with your dad is going to then evolve into your relationship with your significant other, or like there's going to be patterns there." And I didn't really understand, like I didn't understand at that time what that meant. I was kind of like, all right. But then as we kind of tapped into that, I just realized how, with the parental inversion and what I was talking about before, how like I only felt worthy if I was doing something, if I was showing up
Mhm.
as someone, that kind of translated into my relationship, where I would then just kind of do whatever I thought that Matt wanted. It wasn't even that he necessarily had to say
Mhm.
like he wanted something. I just kind of made up these stories in my head and just tried to perform and be who I thought I had to be. And then there was, of course, the resentment that followed that. That was like, but that's not me, or that's not what I wanted to do. And I just violated maybe my own wants or beliefs or needs, whatever it was. And that was a cycle that had started in my childhood that I then had translated over into my relationship. And as I started to become in tune with that, I was like, oh, this is what Bill means. And there's just a lot, I think, like when I envision the trauma child, I just look at my younger little self, and just a child that like wants to be loved and needs, I think through your parents is how you they pour that value into you, and in a lot of ways that kind of got lost in my childhood, and so I think there's a lot of like this younger self trying to like redeem herself. So I was doing so in a way where like I was looking for attention, I wasn't doing it in right ways, I was not being myself and all those things. So I kind of when I'm thinking things or acting out, I have to question like, okay, is this the hurt little girl inside of me, or is this like the real Vanessa? And distinguishing between the two has been challenging, because like we've spoken about, they're kind of just intertwined, and especially in the beginning you don't know what's what. It's figuring out to separate the two, and then I guess diminish as much as possible the trauma child that's kind of controlling everything on the outside.
Yeah, and do me a favor too, clarify parental inversion for people so that they know what they are
Yeah,
dealing
in my case, I took on the role of being a parent, and my parents kind of just were allowed to act as children, because I kind of put myself in a place where I was taking care of my brother, and I was acting as a point of communication between the two. So really, just the way I view it is that I became an adult. I became a parent at the young age of like 7. So that's how, in my case, I view it.
So there's a little twist on that we term substitute mate.
Yep. Yeah, you're right.
And you have a little bit of that going on too. And these things are real. And, like you and anybody else who's been, subject to this kind of dysfunction, you don't really realize it because you're just surviving in the middle of it all. And you're a kid, like you don't have the wherewithal. Adults don't.
Yeah, I never knew that the things I was talking about or the things I knew, like I shouldn't have known. There was conversations in my household, like especially with my dad, between people he was dating, finances, arguments with my parents, like all of these things that that like I really took on the emotional, like his emotions. I took them on completely. And I acted as kind of like his confidant. Like I said before, I was like his go-to person. And that put a lot of pressure on me. And then it fed into that whole thing of like needing to be a certain person that I wasn't meant to be an adult. I wasn't meant to be having those conversations or knowing those things. I didn't have the answers.
Right. And that's why when we talk about that, we talk about it in terms of it robbing our childhood, and then, you in the inside, there's a part of you that just wants to be a daughter.
Yeah.
So the daughter wants to be loved unconditionally, wants to be supported, all those types of things that any healthy daughter would expect from a parent in any healthy kind of a situation. So I'm kind of leaning into this place where it's a dual role. So, you could be a parent could come to you looking for advice, and then you would sit there and listen to it, and then you might even offer something up in terms of that, and they might be grateful for that. But then in the daughter role, there'd be something that you're doing that isn't acceptable to that parent at that point, and then their anger is coming out towards you. So you have like mixed messages coming at you, I would imagine, pretty regularly.
Yeah. And I think I kind of left every situation like never really feeling good, like never feeling fulfilled or ever feeling like I did enough, or like it was always this like kind of this internal thing where I just was like, I have to do better. Or whatever it was, I just never felt like I was doing good enough, just based on those reactions or those situations. So it was definitely an interesting dynamic.
Well, that's what you were saying before, is like everything rested on you. So feeling that obligation on the inside, and sometimes the kid can kind of take on this aspect that they kind of feel important, like, and it's good, like I'm the adult here, I get to make some decisions, and I get to do this, and all those things. But it's really a short-lived and empty kind of a place, because it's like you said earlier, it's really not meant to be in your life at that point.
Yeah.
So like you said, you walked away from any situation feeling bad about it one way or the other.
Yeah, and I think conversations we've had too, like I definitely had those feelings of like, oh well, I'm just the go-to person, and I'm like the face of the family, and in the moment, like yeah, you could feel good about that, but it was like there was always something missing because that wasn't what I actually wanted. I didn't want the recognition of like, oh, we can always go to Vanessa, or oh, Vanessa is her brother's protector. Like it was always made very normal, where it was like, oh, you just care about your brother, or oh, you just love us, and like you want us to get along. Like I would always play like peacemaker, um, and like I would do that. I think in the moment for like some praise that didn't actually end up meaning anything anyway. And then I would just, like I said before, like it was just, well, I'm never fulfilled because I wasn't
Mhm.
actually me. I was just whatever I had to be.
Yep. So as I say all the time, that it just winds up being your ego that's getting stroked in those moments. And the longer that goes on, the less and less fulfilling it is, if it ever was in the first place.
Hmm.
So it's just a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
And the bucket gets bigger all the time because the genuine you is becoming more and more elusive. So back to what you said earlier about, the relationship with Matt and all of that, that was compounding the issue because in that relationship, you weren't the genuine you. You can't be the genuine you one place and not be in another place. Of course, we could play that game, I guess, but when we're
I guess I thought I was, but like at the end of the day, I didn't really know who I was at all in any sense. So,
yeah. So let's talk about a more serious aspect of that that you encountered in doing that, which would be a natural response in these situations is dissociation.
mhm.
Talk about that a little bit because that's a pretty extreme reaction to things like this.
Yeah. Like I was saying before, I was pretty numb to most things, so I just like didn't want to tap into it. I wanted to always like conserve my energy. So especially if like something came up with Matt where it was like a really important conversation. And I think if I kind of felt like I was on the losing end of an argument, I would completely just like go space out and not engage. Because I just thought pretending like it wasn't actually there was better. Because in the moment you could be like, oh, I didn't have to actually win an argument. That's like what I would think in my head, or I don't have to engage in that. My dog is trying to get in on this action right now. But I would do that and then think like, oh, that's benefiting me. I'm just gonna I would think like I was trying to keep things calm. So there was those two sides of like either like thought I was being calm or I was completely on the other end of the spectrum and going crazy. But I wasn't actually keeping calm. I was just completely shutting down and not handling things in a healthy way. And it's funny because in the moment you think doing that helps, but the issue always comes back, and it usually will come back much more intense over time. And that's
Mhm.
where the cycles come into play. And so yeah, there was a lot of that going on where I just wouldn't engage in anything especially where I felt like I could be rejected. Um, I just wanted to shut down and pretend it wasn't actually happening.
Mhm. So you had loads and loads of mechanisms to deflect, to be angry, to dissociate, to do whatever you had to do just to get through.
Yeah, and I think what bothered me was that I never knew what anyone was going to get. I didn't know what I was going to put out. So I didn't know when I was going to be angry. I didn't know when I was going to just go into that mode of shutting down. I didn't know what was triggering what. So it was kind of
Mm.
like if Matt would ask like, "Why are you doing that?" I'd be like, "I don't know," and I genuinely didn't. I had no idea. All right, relax. It's okay. But yeah, so I just I had, like you said, all different ways to try to cope, and I thought that I was kind of handling things, but I wasn't ever.
Okay, so that really kind of sets the stage for, the moving forward aspect of things and how are we doing now, in these areas, because one thing I didn't do in the course of our conversation was tie temperament into it, like propensities,
Hmm.
like that phlegmatic, for example, like wanting to take a 3-hour nap, after expending energy. Um,
Sing,
and
fling, that was real. Is
Mhm.
real, still real, but yeah. then I think even like the cleric, like me, like that always resulted in like the judgment against myself. I would hate myself for doing something that made me look stupid or made me feel stupid. So it was kind of like I was being affected and tapping into all like wrong parts of my temperament. Like the weaknesses were really showing up for me as opposed to any positives.
So moving forward, and exercising things like some self-care, being self-aware, understanding your temperament, including faith into the equation. Those aspects, crucial conversations is another thing that I think we've talked about along the way, like, not just sweeping things under the rug and having these conversations and talking about things that need to be talked about, not just expecting them to go away or dissociating and just like going into la la land and all those types of things.
That's what it was.
So talk a little bit about like how that's been and, moving into a healthier way of life and living.
Yeah, it's all been so important. I think a major turning point for me was like really engaging in like or pinpointing what I wanted because for a very long time I never even was in tune with that side of me. I never allowed myself the space to like have my own thoughts or my own wants and desires. So I remember coming to you and like telling you this was in a session with Matt and saying how like, you know what? I want to live on my own. So like I could be in a position where Matt and I have been together for however many years. Like I could move out of the house and go and live with him. But he got the opportunity to live out on his own. And that was something that I wanted for myself. Whereas in the past, I never would have done that. I never would have thought I was even worthy of living on my own. And I would have just thought I had to go and follow in Matt's footsteps and be with him. And so I think exercising that and just feeling empowered to make my own decisions and to feel what I need to feel. And obviously in a respectful way. It's not like I can now just go around and be like, oh, it's Vanessa's way. But there's a way of going about communicating that in a healthy manner where it's like, hey, I'm allowed to have my opinions. And I don't have to just agree with whatever anyone around me thinks. I can voice those and they're important. I think faith has had that was a big component of it all in terms of just understanding my worthiness and how that didn't come from anybody else. That came from God. So being more and more comfortable with myself and this dog, I can't. But yeah, crucial conversations. That's another thing. I never even like thought I was worthy to have my own opinion. So like I wouldn't usually until I got to a point of like extreme anger. I wouldn't express my opinion. So all of those things have been really important and just uncovering my identity, who I am, what I want out of life. And it's awesome because when you show up as your true self and people accept you that way, you realize like, okay, I didn't have to just pretend this entire time. Like these people actually love me for me and not for this like false self that I was projecting to the world.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of your inner self, the real genuine you that you're getting in touch with, do you find that you have more peace, that you have more joy, contentment, things like that going on?
Yeah. The way I look at it is like before the process, I just dreaded life in general. And it's so sad to say. But I just was always I had this dark cloud that followed me everywhere and everything was kind of just waiting for the next negative to happen and just a lot of heaviness. And I also didn't know who I was. I was just living for other people. So like, there was just a lot of like confusion and all of that. So I think now like also the control aspect, like knowing that not everything falls on me. It never did. Kind of just giving that weight up to God and just obviously like I play my part in everything, but there's a lot of things that I can't control and putting that weight off has been transformative. And I'm just happy. And I can't say that back then I was for a while, at least. Like I was just dealing with a lot of negativity at all times and my own head and all of that stuff. Like we were talking about before we went live, like it was just a lot of like all me and it was all negative up here. So I could never escape it. And Yeah, so I definitely say more peaceful, more confident, just excited about the future, like all of those things.
Hmm. So you don't have to fight your way through every day.
Exactly. It's not like I'm waking up and dreading what's going to happen, because I
Hmm.
think when I've shifted my perspective from being like so angry. I used to say I was angry at the world, but I was really just like I blamed God when that really wasn't the case. Like I just was like, oh, everything, I was dealt a bad hand and all these bad things happened to me. Whereas now I just look at everything that has happened to me as, I don't want to even say has happened to me, but everything that I've experienced like has just shaped me. And if I didn't go through those experiences, maybe I wouldn't be sitting here. I mean, I wouldn't have the same story to share. I wouldn't be able to, maybe someone might hear something and it touches them in some way and inspires them. Like that makes it all worth it. So I just look at it as blessings, and it all just will help me in the future, and terms of whether it's relating to somebody, helping somebody. Like these aren't negative things that I have to kind of just pretend aren't there anymore and like be embarrassed of, or like we were saying before, like having a community of people and people like you where it's like normal to talk about these things and everyone has their own stuff. Like it's okay. Um, and Amanda, she always says to me, she's like, "You're not that bad," and it's so true. It's like we all have our stuff, but like it's never as like bad as you make it out to be in your head. Yeah,
Hmm. Well, that's what happens when you live your life comparing yourself to other people, all the time. And when you do that, of course, you never really measure up.
yeah,
There's never a measuring up, especially if you're carrying the weight of a parental inversion situation in your life. You're never enough. you
exactly.
know and I do want to point out, and then we have one question that's popped up here. We can answer that in a second, but um that place of, you mentioned, confidence, having confidence and knowing who you are, being able to just function in conversations that wherein you don't have to defend yourself, or you don't have to be right, or you don't have to come up with answers or things like that. I wanted to point out that you're 21 now. And when
Hmm.
we started, you were 19. And I say this all the time because I think it's so important, is that, man, when I was 19, 21, I was just partying and just being a jerk until I was 30. And so to be, it's tough enough just being a teenager growing up under, like I said earlier, under normal circumstances, trying to navigate life. But to do what you've done, and Matt, for that matter, too, and a lot of other young people, I think your message is super, super important, that people can hear this, um, in your age group.
Yeah,
To know that, what, there's another way to live this life. There's a way to be in touch. And I think also what you just said about community and what we were talking about earlier is that most people want to hide these things and they don't feel like it's safe to talk about them. Or again, it's like, well, if I share that, then people are going to think I'm any number of things, like I'm weak, or I'm dysfunctional, or I'm no good, or I'm broken. And well, we are those things. And it's okay to understand that, because if you can't, like, you can't be healed of anything unless you admit what needs to be healed, unless you get in touch with what needs to be healed. You can't, whatever's denied can't be healed. And if it just remains inside and we just continue our dysfunctional lifestyles, things are going to implode, especially as life goes by. Because I remember, before you answer this question, I remember um, that thing you mentioned earlier about, like, well, I'm going to marry Matt and it's just going to be great. And it's like this fairy tale wedding kind of a thing. And I would say things like, getting married just like creates more problems. It doesn't, it's not like it's just going to solve all your problems. It's going to
I
create
looked
new
at it as
ones.
like this, like end point. Like once I got there, I've made it. Like I'm good. Like, and in my head, it was just like the one thing keeping me going. And then you were like, no, not the.
Yeah, but those are the notions that we all kind of have when we're growing up, and then, sometimes people think that, well, you're just a downer. Like, what do you have to put a downer on this stuff for? Can't we just enjoy growing up and getting married? And like, yeah, like, do it with your eyes wide open and understand what you're getting yourself into, and do some work so that you're not dragging all of your baggage into that relationship. And you do have a better shot of having a happy, healthy marriage that can withstand the trials that are going to come up in a marriage, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I remember growing up always saying, and this, and in the at that point it came from a place of judgment, but like not wanting to be like my parents and like not wanting to get a divorce. And obviously, I know no one goes into it and signs up for that, but like I see now that if I hadn't if I don't continue to do the work, like I probably would have ended up in a situation similar to that, just because I was in a place of like, oh, I'll never become that. And like you've said before, like usually when you pass that judgment, you end up becoming just like that. So I'm so grateful that I'm able to kind of tap into all of this now, and really work on myself before anything like that is even is it comes to play in terms of engaged marriage, like all of that stuff. Like it's so I'm so happy that I can kind of get myself right, before I then get into a situation like that, so that this way I can really prevent that from happening. And I can set myself up on a good foundation and all of those things, because
Hmm.
that was always like a fear of mine, and I'm sure it would have evolved in a certain type of way if I didn't kind of get the help that I
Well,
need.
even just the part of needing somebody, when you need somebody the way that you believe that you needed Matt, as I would say, you just don't need him. You don't need anybody. It's nice to have somebody and, to get married and those things, but we don't need that person to make me who I am.
Yeah, exactly.
If I'm going to get married, I want to bring a whole person into the marriage. I don't want to go, walk into a marriage like needing this person, to complete me, kind of a thing. It's really not going to work out well that way. So let's get to that question there. Are there any boundaries that you've put in place with your parents?
Yeah, tons. I'd say one of the biggest has just been in terms of like my me being in the middle of their communication. That's something that always took a toll on me, and having to kind of be like they'd go back and forth between me, and even like now, like my brother went away to college, so like my mom will always say like, oh well, me and your dad have no reason to talk now. So she'll just try to be like, oh well, we can talk through you though. So I've had to actively say like, hey, like you got to figure it out. I can't be it's because usually when they wanted me to relay a message, they weren't doing so in a positive way. They definitely weren't speaking the most kind things about one another. So that's also like a hard thing that I didn't really want to engage in. So I've had to just say, listen, I know that you're used to me doing this, and I really just for my own well-being, I can't be in the middle, so you guys have to figure it out yourselves, and I love you both, and I just don't want to be put in the middle. So that's been interesting. There's times where they kind of try to like push my buttons there, but it's made a huge difference, because I then would get into arguments with, like, let's say my mom told me to tell my dad something, then my dad would get mad and be like, well, why are you sticking up for her? When meanwhile, all I was doing was trying to just tell him what she said. And it was always this mess. And it always led to like me kind of being the bad guy, even though I was trying to do the right thing. So really just honoring my feelings and doing so in a respectful way, so that they know where I'm coming from. I'm not just like being nasty and saying, hey, don't talk to me, but just explaining where it's coming from, and letting them know that that really doesn't help me in any way. So they've had to figure that one out. But yeah, I mean, it's so important.
Anything else specific that you can share?
Yeah, even going back to like situations with my dad, where my dad would confide in me and like really treat me like his equal. I've had to have some conversations about that, and I've spoken to him about what that dynamic looked like and how it's kind of translated into like me and the work that we're doing. And he's acknowledged it, and he has recognized that like I was put in a place that I shouldn't have been at a very young age. But I still have to check that too, and just being like, dad, I can't hear this. So it's really just a lot of usually information that like I shouldn't be taking on like these conversations or these emotions, and having to just kind of be like, hey, I love you, I'm here for you, but not really appropriate or not my place, whatever it might be.
Hmm. That's great. That's good, healthy stuff to learn how to do. I'm sure a lot of people are going to benefit from hearing that,
And
although
that's
it's,
not to say it's easy, because I used to feel so guilty when I did it. And it went back to that whole people pleasing thing where like, I'm letting them down. I'm not doing what they want of me. But I notice more and more that the more I do what's good for me, I'm actually better able to show up and be more supportive, more kind, more whatever it is that's needed of me. I'm able to do that when I just do it in the right way, when I
Mhm.
honor like my own needs.
That's part of self-care,
Yeah,
by
I
the way.
definitely was not familiar with that.
Hmm. So speaking of self-care and other issues, kind of moving towards closing here, what do you want to share with especially people in your age group? Because the reality is, I would venture to say that 80 to 90%, if not more, of people in any age group, really, but especially young people, are growing up in some kind of dysfunctional situation in their households, one way or the other, whether it's divorce, whether it's, addictions, or whether it's just situations where parents don't know how to parent, which I certainly, nobody knows how to parent. No, it's like you don't, it's, you think when you get married and have kids, like somehow you're going to do that. And then when you have kids, you just start to realize like how ill-equipped you really, really are. So nobody really knows how to parent, obviously, perfectly. So everybody has a degree of brokenness. A lot of us are in denial. A lot of us are doing exactly what you did, coping and hoping, and some even worse. You know, um, using drugs, drinking. All kinds of mechanisms that they're using just to not have to deal with it or run away from it or anything like that. So after going through what you've been going through, what do you want to share with people as an encouragement to move forward in a healthier way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing for me that was helpful, and I was talking about this to you before. It's not that like it's good to hear that people are going through things, but I think knowing that everybody has trauma, everybody has things that have affected them positively, negatively, and knowing that that's normal. That was the first thing. Like I think I didn't ever want to admit it because I didn't want to seem like weak or there's that like stigma. So I think once you know that, you can then at least hopefully take a step in a direction of helping yourself and putting yourself first. So for me, that was working with you, Bill, and engaging in the process. And what I would say is that with that, when you go on that journey of work, however, in whatever capacity, it's definitely not easy. It hurts. It's hard, but it is so rewarding. And I know it's a process that I think I'll be on for the rest of my life. And there's always going to be things that need to be worked on, and it's never going to be easy. But in the moment, you can think by not acknowledging something, it's like beneficial, but it ends up not being that way, and it will just continue to manifest in all different ways. So I think if you can tackle it, do it. And it's hard, and it takes energy. It's been a crazy few years, but I'm just so grateful because who I've become on, and I don't want to say the other side because I'll never reach the other side, but who I am now at this point. We were speaking a bit about how I spoke at an event a few years ago, and I just want to even go back and watch that. This has brought up a bunch of memories because I know that I'm a completely different person in the best way, but that's because I put myself out there to do it. It wasn't just going to magically happen. I had to open myself up to all of it. So
Hmm.
I would
Hmm.
just say, I guess, put yourself first and dig in and tap into that however you can. And it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah, the putting yourself first part is not an ego thing. It's a and
When I
it's
say stuff like that, it all like came from a place of me never doing that. So it wasn't like I was trying to do so in a selfish way. It was just like
yeah, it's a
actually doing something
self-care
good
thing
for
so
you.
that you
Yeah.
yeah, you realize that you must, so that you can pay attention to what you're doing that's actually destroying you. And then in turn, it's going to destroy all your relationships around you as well.
Yep.
Um, yeah, because all those mechanisms. So then I asked you what book you wanted to recommend, and of course you said, I don't know whether we can see that or not.
It's
There
captive.
we go. I think we can see a little bit of it there.
Yeah.
Yeah, Captivating by Eldridge. Um, how has that helped you?
Goes back to the whole thing about my worth and just how I that comes from God, my belief. Like I just that didn't really have anything else to do with anybody else, because that's always how I kind of look through the lens of other people. So just in terms of that journey of just loving myself, understanding my worth, who I am, really great. I read that in the beginning of the process. So
Got you in touch with God a little bit too. It's probably a little bit abstract in the beginning, I would imagine.
yeah, definitely. Because I didn't really understand, like, oh, okay, like, but like in theory it sounded nice, but now I really do understand. So I definitely would recommend that one.
Hmm. So you're much more rooted and grounded now.
Yep.
Hmm. That's really awesome. Well, thanks for, kind of taking on the role of the guest,
Thank you so
and
much for having me. It was awesome.
not just the guest host. And I just got to do the shameless plug for the
Of
process
course,
too,
as you should.
because yeah, everything that we're talking about today is in the process. And like you said earlier, it's a process that we're really on. It's a life journey. There is no real destination. The destination is the process.
Mhm.
And if we can engage in the process in such a way, that we can get in touch with, wow, I just want to show this up there too. Um, we can get in touch with the stuff that you've talked about today and more, whatever our brokenness happens to contain. And then the other aspect too is that just like you did today, it's like we share with the community around us, and it really helps other people to, get up the courage to be able to face their demons and what's going on inside of them, and not keep it hidden, and disqualify themselves as a result of that. And even if we don't like verbally disqualify myself or like overtly do that, like in your case, I think what you just did is you just, because of the parental inversion and you had to do stuff, is you just kept barging on, you know,
Mm.
and like you said, like if you would imagine if you would have gotten married that way, like with that lie in place, how and so many people just do that. So many people just do that and just think like it's gonna work out that way. And I can't tell you, and this is like I get people coming in from anywhere from 4 months, 6 months to a year, up to 2 years of being married, and then they come in and say like, I don't even know why I got married. But they didn't want to do the work. They didn't want to get in touch with these things before they got married. They bought that lie like it's just going to be beautiful. It's going to be great. We can do anything. We love each other so much, blah, 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 blah. And all of that. As soon as you get married, everything changes, and that dysfunction has an opportunity to manifest, because that's what relationships do. Whether it's in a marital relationship or in friendships or in a business relationship, we see it all the time in business relationships. People have a hard time just doing that,
Mhm.
because all of their personal issues start to rise to the surface. And that's a
Yep.
whole nother show. But again, thanks for, being such a great guest and being so open and vulnerable with all of your sharing. And
Thank you so much for having me.
yeah, and you'll be back next week when we have another special guest. We don't know who that is yet, but it'll be good, whoever it is.
Bound to be good, whoever it is.
For sure. And thanks for everybody who is watching today. Share it with your friends, especially young friends that would benefit from hearing about Vanessa's story. And I think that's about it, right?
Yeah.
So you know what time it is, Ness, right?
Yeah. EIS out.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.